Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you very much for turning up to our webinar this morning, which is all about making the most of your Office 365 subscription with PowerApps. A little bit of housekeeping before we do get started. Expecting this morning's webinar to last for approximately 30 minutes with an opportunity then for any questions that you guys may have. You should find within the Zoom interface, you actually have the ability to chat either amongst yourselves or indeed with me during today's session, but also to virtually raise your hand. So if you do have any questions as we're going through, don't feel you need to wait until the end. Feel free to chuck those at me as we're going along, so that if there is anything you want more detail on, anything that you think is particularly pertinent to you, let me know, and I'm very happy to take some segues, deviate from what I'm taking you through, in order to make sure that you guys who are attending are getting as much out of this morning's session as possible. So without any further ado, let's get into the main event, which is all about how you can make use of PowerApps, which you may or may not be familiar with as an application, as a suite of tools that you actually get with most Office 365 subscriptions at E3 or above. So give me a moment here. I'm just going to pop myself into Google Chrome. So what I've got is a simple test tenant with only one user in it, which I'm going to be using for this morning's session. I've already configured a SharePoint area along with the usual user stuff. So I've got email, I've got OneDrive, etc. And I'm going to be exploring PowerApps specifically to take a look at a couple of simple implementations of PowerApps. And one that links together quite nicely. I've got an end-to-end solution for submission of a service ticket. So going into PowerApps itself from the launch pad there, and PowerApps is split into the console here, which allows me to view apps that I've created or that have been shared organization-wide, to create brand new ones, either completely from scratch or by using something called a canvas, which are basically some pre-built templates that Microsoft deploy that you can adapt for your own purposes, which are actually very good. We'll take a look at some of those shortly. And then you've got PowerApps Studio, which is the online tool that you can use to actually build, configure, and customize your apps. Now, I'm not going to be going into a huge amount of detail here. We've only got 30 minutes, so it's going to be a bit Blue Petery. You know, here's something I made earlier, rather than building that from scratch completely. But it will give you an idea of capability and hopefully some thought pieces in terms of what you'll be able to then configure within your own organizations. The whole point of PowerApps is that it is effectively application development for non-application developers. Across organizations, we have a lot of people that are involved in all kinds of different processes that they ultimately are on the sharp end of or are experts in terms of the design and implementation of them. By using PowerApps, we can empower those people theoretically to actually build technology to support those processes. For example, you might have within an accounting or a finance department or function within your organization a requirement for people to submit expense requests. So to fill out what they've had, receipt information, mileage, that sort of thing, and to be able to submit that through some kind of process where it's signed off by managers or a central finance function before that money is then ultimately paid to that staff member. You can use and you can purchase lots of third-party expense claim software, which is fine. But the problem with that is that that wasn't built for your organization. That's very general applications that you're purchasing. And so when it comes to wanting to tailor those to meet your exact processes, your exact policies, you often have to pay or get additional add-ons, or it falls to someone within an IT department to then customize those. With PowerApps, if we can provide to your finance managers, your payroll staff, for example, the ability to make their own apps with their own processes, they're going to understand much better than a third-party organization or even your own internal IT function how they need that to function, from the front end for the user to the back end in terms of what they see and what they then need to process. And PowerApps theoretically will give them the tools to be able to do that. So let's take a look first of all in the studio at the back end in terms of development of an app. So if I just go within the interface here on the left-hand side, I've got a few apps that I've put together. A service desk app, one of which is in a mobile format, the other of which is designed for tablets. These also work on a desktop, but PowerApps is very much being developed with mobile devices in mind. So people out in the field or just on their own devices within the office actually kind of submitting data or pulling it through. And I'm going to start actually with that example that I just gave around expense claims. Now, if I just go into the edit part of this, this will open up PowerApps Studio, which is where I can actually change the way that this app behaves, change the way that it looks, connect it to different data sources, export it if I wish to do so, duplicate it if I want to have multiple apps doing something similar but to different locations. And this is this particular app, just a simple self-contained app, this one, where the data, there we go, so I'm not interested in a tour on this occasion. So what this will give me is the ability to create, store and manage expense claims basically within the application itself. Now, where PowerApps gets incredibly useful to us as an organization is when we have the ability to actually hook it into external data sources, things like SharePoint, SQL, OneDrive, Outlook. And I have got an example of one of those a little later, but for now, I just want to begin by taking you through how this kind of works really in terms of the back end. Now, this is an app that I've built from a template and then customized. Now, the apps themselves are broken down into a number of screens, which you can see I've got on the left-hand side here. If I just collapse the main screen there, each of those screens are reached through completely different means basically within the application interface itself. So for example, for my expenses app, I've got my home screen, which is what you'll get when you open the app up by default. And within there, it's got a load of expense information for the user that's currently using the app. So I've got how many expense claims I've got open, how many are pending, how many have been approved. I've got the ability to take a look at reports. So this gives the end user an awful lot of intelligence basically into what they've submitted historically and what they've currently got open. So the Studio interface is split up into something that in all fairness is not actually too dissimilar from things like Microsoft Excel, particularly when we get to this area here in the middle of the screen, which is a formula bar, which anybody who's used Excel will be incredibly used to. Each screen is broken down into a number of objects, okay, and those objects, if I just click into the screen here, I can select one of the objects that I've got. If I can just get off there we go. If I go to the Insert tab at the top, these are the things that I can create within my app. So I can create entirely new screens, which can be completely blank. They can be scrollable, a list of objects, a form, it can be a people picker, meeting notes. I can put a calendar in or a tutorial if I need to teach people how to use my app. Once I've got my screens, what I can then do is insert some of these objects here. That can be things that are as simple as a label, which will just display information, or a button, which is used to initiate something. So I've got a couple of examples of those here. For example, I've got my label, which is used to calculate the amount of, there we go. So the total amount of, let me just zoom into the interface a bit here if I can. Just make that a little bit easier for you to see what I'm doing. There we go. So I've got here how many expenses are currently open, and that is a calculated field, okay? So at the moment, I can see that's coming back with false. However, if I come over to here, what it should do is enable me to actually take you through how this value was reached, okay? In terms of what it's displaying and in terms of ultimately what is contained within there. So if I go into this object, I've got pending right next to it. I should, although the formula bar is not behaving itself at the moment, I should be able to actually show you how that value was calculated. Let me try one of these other ones down here. That might be, there we go. Perfect. So here, what I've got is I've got a meet and greet, which I'm claiming an expense for, and I can see a value of £3,200 was ultimately reached. Now, if I take a look in the formula bar, you can see that the way that that value is generated, it's got a pound sign, first of all, as a text string. And then what it does is it effectively filters the data in the back end of this particular app in order to then display all of the different fields summed together, which then gives me a total cost. Now, I'll just zoom out again here, just so I can take you through this. Okay. And although we have what is effectively a WYSIWYG interface, what we see is what we get when we're designing these. And you can see from the app that I've got here that I am by no means a graphic designer myself, but you can make these things actually look quite pretty. The beauty of the Studio interface is the ability to actually test it as you're going. And there's two ways that we can do this. First of all, we can play the app, okay, which enables me to interact with it as though I were on the device it's intended for. So if I click on the plus symbol at the top there, what it does enables me to navigate through the different screens. I can see I've got date pickers here, a title. I can choose who needs to approve it. Again, these are stored within the actual app themselves, although you can get them to pull through from your company directory or from a SharePoint list if you wish to do so. I can assign it to different cost centers, and then I can create my expense claim, which will then ultimately take me through to a page like this, where I've got a summary at the top. Again, I've got my calculated fields, and I can then start putting in individual line items. Now, that preview is absolutely fine, except for the fact that it can be quite time consuming. So what's quite nice about this interface, if I hold down the Alt key, it enables me to basically interact with the elements around this particular app in such a way as though I were previewing it effectively. So I can then actually interact with, open these things up, close them, so on and so forth, while then removing my finger from the Alt key and being able to actually interrogate them individually. Going back to the different objects that I can add here, so labels, buttons, simple text, inputs, which can be everything from the drop-down box, date picker, people picker, so on and so forth, all the way through to tables, media such as videos or images, charts if I want to have those on there, if I've got data in the back end. If any of you are used to using Power BI, you can actually import and display those within the Power App as well. So you can get this amazing functionality where you build a nice front end for people to be able to interrogate data potentially. So this is just really to give you an idea of the structure of these apps, broken down into screens and then objects that are contained within them. Let's take another look at a slightly different example within here. So if I go back to my apps that I've got available, let's take a look at, first of all, the Service Desk tablet that I've got. So this will have a completely different interface compared to what we just saw with the expense claims, because this was designed with a tablet in mind rather than a mobile device. Now, when I open it up, what it actually then gives me is the ability to use the app. Okay, so I didn't open this one in edit mode, and you can see again, if I do then want to edit that particular app, I'll just go back to the previous page, click edit, and this will show you what it looks like again on that back end in terms of PowerApps Studio. Just give that a moment to load. One thing I should mention about PowerApps, it can be a bit slow at times, particularly when you're connecting multiple different data sets, but it's quite a powerful tool, so it's doing an awful lot for us. So in here, again, you can see I have a number of screens. In this particular instance, quite a few less screens than we had before, but this is the page to create a brand new ticket. You can then set variables effectively. You can store those on their own pages. Now, those pages will never be displayed to the user, but they contain fields, here we go, which can then be referenced in formulas on other pages. So, for example, I've got the ticket status page here, which has in progress, on hold, and closed, with different colors next to them, depending on which one is selected. If I then take a look at the create new ticket page, okay, and where I've then got my priority, okay, you can see it chooses the priority types here and the value that it's got from my priority page. So if I needed additional priorities, I can actually display them within here, and it's all down to how they're labeled, what it's treating these as. So we've got here a priority gallery with a data source in there of the priority types. These are variables you store either in the background. In this particular instance, again, they're actually stored within the app itself, But if you wanted those linked to an external data source, it's possible to do that as well. And again, what we're aiming to do here is to give these tools and this functionality to our end users or to power users within parts of our organization in order to enable them to take ownership of their particular business area and to put these apps together as front ends for users or for themselves to make use of to connect to other parts of Office 365, whatever that may be. Now, I have got a worked example here which will actually take us through the data being stored in SharePoint with a Power App on the front end that then initiates what's known as a flow, which is an automated process that will then send out an automated email. So while these are beautiful, great things, the problem with the self-contained Power Apps is you're then relying on somebody going into that app to actually check for, in this case, service tickets, or in the previous example, to check for any new expense claims that need to be processed. Where we truly get value out of this is when we actually start connecting everything up together, joining all the dots up, so that what we have is a place to store our data, a Power App to interact with it, and then some automated process in the back end, which brings it all together. So if I just get myself into a SharePoint site that I have created, okay, within here, I've got a very simple help desk SharePoint list, which is, for those of you that aren't too familiar with SharePoint, this is nothing more than a data table. Think of it as being a little bit like an online spreadsheet. But the beauty of it is, because it's in SharePoint, it can be viewed by lots of different people, and I can treat each line in this data set, in this list, independently in terms of its life cycle. Now, what I've done with this particular SharePoint list, which you can see is completely empty at the moment, is I've put a Power App on the front end, which if somebody fills out that Power App, theoretically, what it will do is capture the data they put into the fields in the Power App and then put them into the SharePoint list. What should then happen is there should be a flow which is waiting for new items to be created, which will then package up that information and send an email to my email account, is the way that I've configured this one, notifying me that a new item has been added, something that I need to take action with. So this is basically just a kind of simple example taken through a ticketing interface. So let's take a look at how it works. Now, the way that you actually access the Power Apps themselves is either through, so if I was a user looking to add a new service ticket, I would either use a mobile device with the Power Apps app, so the Power Apps app for Google or for Android or iOS, or alternatively, I can do it through the desktop interface if I've got some method of navigating to it, which best way of doing that? Through hyperlinks and embedding these into web pages. So you can actually, again within SharePoint, you can have something called a web part, which will allow us to put the Power App into the page itself. But for my purposes, what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to navigate into Power Apps itself, find the app in question, and then we'll see how this behaves with SharePoint. So the app is called Service Desk. Again, not going to look massively beautiful, but it will have the functionality I need. So what I've got on the first screen here with the Power App that's on the front end for this help desk list is a view of that list, which at the moment is empty because there's nothing in it. But shortly, I should actually be able to see a summary of all of the items in that list without the need to go to SharePoint itself. So although I've got the data stored somewhere else, I can still see it within the app. So I'm not having to go backwards and forwards between creating things, checking them, so on and so forth. I've got a button up in the top right here, which will allow me to create a new item within that list. Okay. And what it will do is it will pull through the columns I've got in that list and create fields within the Power App in order to fill those out. So, for example, going back into the SharePoint area itself in PowerApps. Okay, and into the help desk list that I've got here, I've created a number of columns which are expecting different types of data, and I've actually configured all of this within SharePoint in terms of the choices. So if you've got SharePoint list configured, PowerApps becomes very easy once you've connected the two together in order to actually create a nice front end for it. So for example, where I have the assigned to column, I've configured that as a people picker, and that should translate back into PowerApps itself. Likewise with priority, that's from a list of choices, and those choices should be in the Power App. So if I'm in the Power App itself, here we go, I can configure a title, which goes into that first column. Depending on whether or not I've specified that the columns should be mandatory within SharePoint, again, copies through to PowerApps, so that if it's mandatory as a column in SharePoint, it will be a mandatory field within the Power App itself. So they're constantly talking to each other, these two bits of functionality. So in the title there, I'm just going to put slow internet, which fortunately we're not suffering from here today, content. And then in the description, can't get onto websites, will be fine. So those are simple text fields, no validation or anything on there, just expecting something to be in there. When I click on categories, okay, I've then got these different items that I can have, which I've not defined back in the SharePoint list, but you could change those. Percentage complete should only accept numbers, so I can set that to 0% to begin with. Then the priority, okay, those should also be pulling through along the task status from the SharePoint list itself. And when I get to the assigned to, I should be able to search for myself within there. That should resolve to my name, so that when I commit this particular item, sometimes you do get a little bit of a glitch with these, whereby it doesn't actually show up straight away. But if I give the app a quick refresh, I can see that's been entered into there, and it has picked up my choice, even though it didn't give it to me. I've got that in there. Task status was low. So I think that might have been a display glitch in terms of the choices it was pulling back through. It should have actually given me those names. Okay, and so I've got that listed within the app. If I then go back into SharePoint itself, just let me close some of these tabs that I've got open. One thing about Office 365 is it does like to open one or two tabs as you're going around. You should see, there we go, what was entered into those fields back in the Power App has now been actually created as an individual list item within SharePoint itself. And just joining the dots here, if I check my email, so if I get into Outlook here, I received an email, there we go, 11:21, so a couple of moments ago, which contains information entered into the fields in the Power App, which then went into the columns within SharePoint, have now been put into the message. There we go, they've got the details in there, which have now been actually sent to me as an email. Now, the method for that that I used in order to get that to generate was very simply flow. So within the list itself, I've created a very simple flow. There we go, sending a customized email when a new SharePoint list item is added. And again, although this is quite powerful in terms of what it enables me to do, connecting together different parts of Office 365 that would ordinarily be completely disparate systems, it's a WYSIWYG interface. I don't need to be a developer in order to understand this. It just gives me a nice flow chart. Step 1, item is created. Step 2, get the profile. Step 3, send the email. If I want to customize the fields that come through into that particular email, I can do so by using dynamic content, which will then use the columns that I've got in the SharePoint list, which of course were the fields that were in the Power App. So it all joins together, although I always say it might be easier if they just call things the same thing rather than having to have a field that becomes a column that becomes dynamic content. But as long as you've got a rough idea of where things are, it's actually not too difficult to join those dots. We can take this further as well. We can use this for things like approval, content approval, etc. if we need that. We can have analytics that are then generated off the back of it. We can have Power BI, which is taking a look at how long these things are taking to be completed, or how many expense claims have been made against certain events. You know, the possibilities are endless by using these different tools. But PowerApps is the front end. It is the engine that enables people to interact with that functionality that sits behind it. Some of you, particularly if you've used SharePoint historically, may be used to InfoPath and SharePoint Designer workflows, and effectively this is replacing that and doing much better with it as well. InfoPath was quite unwieldy, quite clunky, whereas PowerApps much more streamlined and really aimed at mobile devices, as we saw with the fact that you can have them aimed at tablets, aimed at phones, but still usable within the pages that we've got on our websites as well. So just joins all of those dots together. So just a few simple examples that I've taken you through there. Depending on your organization, you'll have lots of different types of data, processes, so on and so forth. But hopefully that's given you some food for thought with the way that you can use these tools to really, as I say, empower your users. I would not recommend necessarily loading your IT department with the responsibility for the creation of these different Power Apps and the sites behind them and flows, etc. Much better going straight to the person that knows what they need. Get your HR department to put together their appraisal form because they know the information they want and the steps it needs to take. And it's just a case of giving them, as I say, the tools a bit of exposure to it. Okay, that's all I've got in terms of what I wanted to show you here. So let me just take a quick look and see how we're doing with regards to any questions. As I say, within the Zoom interface, you do have the ability to take a look at questions and answers. You should be able to raise your hand, or you should be able to actually submit questions, which I can then obviously respond to. So if you have got any burning questions, anything you would like to know more about, or anything I said didn't make any sense, or you want more detail on, then I'm very happy to answer those questions now, and use this as a kind of little bit of a kind of informal workshop in some ways. So I can see, let's have a look. Brilliant. So I've got a question here, which is, just let me make sure I understand what this is saying. Okay, permissions. Right, great. So question is, what permissions are required to be able to make use of PowerApps and to make use of SharePoint? So you need to make sure within Office 365, you actually have the ability to basically delegate different administrative privileges. You will find that users are able to create their own PowerApps and their own flows that will only affect them. But as soon as you want somebody to be able to create something that is then organization-wide, which is going to be used to collect lots of information to follow a particular process, you need to make sure that the person that's doing that, the account they're using, has the appropriate permission with the SharePoint list, with the SQL database, so on and so forth. So for the example I've just shown you there, going through and creating a front end for a SharePoint list, I had to be a list administrator to do that. And the way that PowerApps handles that is very simply when I'm actually within, so if I go into edit mode here, it handles it through something called connections. Okay, so if I go into the actual PowerApp itself and take a look, you can see it's on the left hand side there, connections. I'll wait for this just to load and I'll show you where it figures this stuff out. But the idea is, any minute now, there we go, perfect. That, I've got a file on the left hand side and then connections. What this will do is show you the connections that I've got configured. And so there we go, you can see approvals, Office 365 Outlook, users, SharePoint, different SharePoint areas, planner, etc., even MSN Weather. You can even hook these into Facebook, Twitter, etc. It's got connections to things like Dropbox. So it's not just Microsoft stuff. You can connect it to external systems as well. But you can see here, I've got OneDrive, okay, and at the moment it's saying can't sign in, wants to fix the connection. Now the reason for that is my password's changed, and in order to fix the connection, all you have to do is basically re-authenticate, but it won't let you create a PowerApp or create a flow that is connected to something you do not have permission yourself to use. Yeah, it's all handled basically through Azure AD, effectively, or SharePoint permissions. Yeah, you need to make sure you've got administrative access to external systems. Otherwise, people can only create them for themselves. Okay, any other questions? Okay, follow-up questions for that. Yes, you can turn off users being able to create their own apps. So you can really refine it down so that only certain power users or whoever you want has the ability to do that, whereas your bog standard users won't have access to anything other than being able to use the apps somebody else has created for them. So you can lock this down. I quite understand you probably don't want people creating their own expense claim app, etc. Yeah, you can lock this down as you can with all parts of Office 365 just by disabling that particular part of their license. So relatively straightforward to do that. Okay, another question here. Yes, so asking about difference between templates and blank PowerApps. Blank PowerApps are exactly what you would expect. There's nothing in them, and so basically what you have to do is create everything from scratch. I would always advise start with your data source and build from there. So the way I built that little service desk app was I built the SharePoint list and then I added PowerApp and connected it to it, which just connected all the fields up. I could have created a blank app, created SharePoint independently, and then linked the two together, but that's much more time consuming, and it's much easier to actually create it from the data source. You can always then kind of go off on your own tangent, add additional screens, so on and so forth, but at least you've got a starting point. Creating apps completely from scratch is only really suitable where you're trying to do something that is going to be completely self-contained. So if you wanted, for example, a survey app that you had field agents going out, getting information from customers or whoever it may be, and it's all stored within the app and then exported, then it might be suitable to start from blank. But even in that instance, I would say you're probably better off putting something into their OneDrive or into an Excel spreadsheet or something, rather than actually storing it all within the app itself. So you can do, but I always think, why start from nothing completely? You're much better off starting from the data that you need to get. Okay. Any other questions here, guys? So thank you for those couple there, just a couple of clarifying points. But I can't see any more, so I'm going to assume that that is giving you guys exactly what you need, assuming you're still there. So just to clarify, PowerApps, application development for non-application developers. Get your power users, get people passionate about your organization. We do it here at Quanta. We have people in our events team that wanted a particular dashboard and the ability to update information about our courses, rather than raising that with an IT tech for them to build it for them, and for them to then go backwards and forwards. Oh no, that's not quite right, so on and so forth. We got them to build it themselves, and it's much better. It does what they need it to do, and if they want to change it, they can. They have the ability to do that. And so, application development for non-application developers. Obviously, give you the little sales spiel here. At Quanta, we run a 2-day course on PowerApps and Flow, connecting these dots together, giving you the ability to get, hit the ground running with these things, and actually start building these within your organization. So if you have got some super users that might be interested in that, wonderful little 2-day course. Always nice when you're creating things. You've got something tangible at the end of it, and demystifies a lot of the interface, really, which is it looks more complicated than it necessarily needs to be. Okay. We do have another webinar later today, running at 2 p.m. around CompTIA courses and how those might be useful for people that are just coming into IT or looking to further their careers in a new way. You can find details on that on the Quanta website and also on our blog. So if you're interested, feel free to sign up to that one as well. But other than that, thank you very much for your time, guys. And for those of you that are watching post-event, so if you're watching the recording of this, if you have any questions about anything we've gone through or anything else Quanta might be able to help with, please feel free to get in touch either with your account manager or by submitting a query through our website. So that's brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. Have a good day.